In today's episode, I'm joined by Aaron Marston-Pattison, who is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University and has been a participant in the 2024 Menzies Early Career Network. The network has brought together Australian university students to engage in history of the Menzies era, connect with peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in this program, our 2024 participants contributed to a new book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. In today's episode, I'll be asking Aaron about his chapter in this book, Popular Criticism of Robert Menzies' War Aims. Aaron, what a fascinating topic, and I think ripe for research and understanding.
Yeah.
Why did you choose this topic?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that really interests me about this topic, and about sort of the question of war aims in regards to the Second World War and this kind of question of, what are we fighting for, right? Is that it's one of those things that in hindsight, I think seems incredibly obvious to us, right? I think there's sort of, there's no real kind of in the history of human conflict other sort of so morally clear-cut example, I guess, is the Second World War. But you have to remember in 1939, this isn't really the case, right? This is, sort of the horrors of the Nazi regime haven't really been put on display yet. The Holocaust doesn't really kind of ramp up until, 1941. Most of Europe hasn't been subjected to kind of German occupation yet. So there's this real kind of, I just think it's very interesting that there's this real kind of pertinent question at the time of, kind of what are we fighting for? What is this about that in the current day sort of seems so obvious, but obviously wasn't to them. And I think it's also interesting sort of looking at Menzies and the position he's in here, essentially being asked with that question in mind of what it's about. He's kind of being asked to sell an imperial war again to a population sort of 20 years after they've just been through that, that are much more reluctant to accept that reality than they perhaps were in 1914. So I think looking at kind of how he does that and how people respond to that is just super fascinating in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's allegations often thrown at Menzies that he was an appeaser,
Mhm.
and that that's said in sort of in the context of the hindsight of, well, of course you would have been opposed to Hitler, of course you would have been opposed to Imperial Japan. I mean, there should never have been a question of appeasing Hitler and trying to allowing him to at least sort of meet some of his own aims. But I mean, as you say, the zeitgeist of
Mhm.
the 30s was war weary. It
Mhm.
was obviously traumatized by the depression as well, and so being an appeaser or having a sense that we'd prefer to avoid this rather than confront this
Mhm.
was that was totally understandable point of view. And in fact, John Curtin, who was opposition leader, Labor leader, was very much in his statements was calling for peace and appeasement as well. So I mean, this was sort of a quite a mainstream view, but the rewriting of history seems to be sort of condemnatory of this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think not just sort of, Menzies and Curtin. This was a very popular policy throughout Australia, right? This was the dominant kind of, and I think until the sort of the Munich, piece of the sort of the failure of the Munich Agreement, um, sort of woke a lot of people up to the idea that, okay, maybe, sort of he can't be trusted and, we are going to have to go down that sort of unfortunate route. But I think, yeah, definitely prior to that, it was definitely the popular opinion in Australia that war should be avoided sort of at all costs, right?
Yeah, yeah. So why do you think it was? I mean, so Menzies makes a speech articulating the aims of this war. He makes a declaration of war that Britain is at war with Germany, Australia is now at war with Germany. And again, that's been criticised as sort of just, well, did Australia have no agency? Are they, why was it a natural consequence of Britain being at war that Australia would be at war? But why was it was it necessary for Robert Menzies as Prime Minister in 1939 to articulate these war aims when that hadn't been the case for in the First World War?
Yeah, well, I think that Australia and the world is a very different place in 1939 to what it had been in 1914, right? I think you have to keep in mind the sort of the importance of the imperial kind of way of life and the sort of imperial framework with which most people in 1914 sort of used to see the world and to understand the world, right? The kind of the most important thing, sort of strategically speaking, to Australia in 1914 was the sort of continued dominance of Britain, right? And the kind of the safety of Britain as a world power. There wasn't really any immediate threat to Australia itself, right? Japan was a British ally. They fought with the Allies, of course, in the First World War. Other than arguably maybe sort of German raiders and the German colonial empire in kind of Southeast Asia, Australia itself felt much more, I guess, kind of safe than it would come to feel in 39. Um, and I think as well in 1914, there's kind of this, the glory of war as an idea is still very dominant, right? These are people that have grown up kind of reading, empire adventure stories where, British soldiers will go to some, corner of the globe and fight some local people, and that's seen as a very kind of heroic, valorous, adventurous thing.
Mm.
But by the time of the Second World War, by the time of 1939, this has all changed, right? There are strategic threats close to Australia. Japan's no longer an ally. They're increasingly kind of looking threatening and expansionistic. And the sort of the glory of war has dissipated as well, right? I think about my sort of great grandmother, who I had the privilege of knowing because she got to sort of live to quite an old age, but she grew up in the sort of interwar period in the 30s, and she would talk about one of her neighbors who was disfigured from the gas of the First World War and how like horrifying that was to her as a child. And I bring that up because it's not a unique situation, right? A lot of people would have been faced with those sorts of things, or would have had family members die, or they were in 1939, there was a greater knowledge of how brutal war actually was and what a war would look like, right? That wasn't there in 1914. Um,
So,
I, oh,
yeah, that sense that Australians were all in at the start of the war in 1939 is just, I mean, it's clearly not the case based
mm,
on your research. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I think that was.
Tell me so Menzies articulates the war aims. What does he say?
So I think essentially his main sort of concern is ensuring kind of stability in Europe and a kind of reevaluation of the European order. There are a couple of sort of differences between speeches, but mainly there's sort of a few consistent points that we can draw out. I think so one of them is the kind of re-establishment of, international peace and stability, which he sees as being done through an intergovernmental organization, kind of not dissimilar to the League of Nations, but something with perhaps a bit more teeth, probably something like the UN, which we end up with, right? Um, he was also big on the idea of a defeated Germany needed to be sort of treated carefully, I suppose. He was very concerned about repeating the mistakes of Versailles, and so he was big on the idea that the German people need to be sort of separated from the Nazi government. That no big reparations should be put on Germany, that its territorial integrity should be respected, that sort of thing. And sort of connected to that was this idea of, he recognized that the sort of map of Europe needed to be redrawn, but it didn't necessarily need to be along the lines of the pre-war boundaries, right? So he was big on this idea of kind of independence for independent peoples, which I think was an extension of kind of, the idea of self-determination that came after the First World War. But sort of expanded, I suppose, to be inclusive of the Germans and of the German minorities and what their kind of wishes were. Yeah, he didn't want to give them a grudge that they could sort of, use to try this again in the future.
It's interesting too. He calls for that separation of
Mm.
the German government, Hitler and the Nazis from the German people themselves, and that the German people were actually victims of the Nazis, just like the Czechs were and the Poles were. So I mean, and he writes speaks about this, of course, in his Forgotten People broadcast as well. You know, you shouldn't use hate as a weapon of war. It should
Yeah.
we should realize that these are everyday people. We might disagree, obviously, seriously disagree with their governments and leadership, but the people, we need to, you know, maintain an understanding of their own human condition
Yeah.
and concerns.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, were these war aims, as he articulated, were they good enough for Australians?
No, not particularly. Look, there was there was sort of significant support, but there was also a lot of backlash. I think sort of one of the problems that people had was that they saw his war aims as being too kind of vague and too sort of, typical politician speech, right? As they saw it, kind of too, saying a lot without actually saying much. And I think this worried a lot of people because it was very reminiscent of the kind of rhetoric of the First World War, right? He talked a lot about, making the world safe for democracy and preserving civilization. Well, what does that mean, right? What does that actually look like to us? Um, Another problem people had is that he didn't sort of, in their minds, address the here and the now, right? The problems facing everyday Australians in their ordinary lives, right? Again, this is an Australia coming out of the Depression, we have to remember. People are still recovering. There's still a lot of poverty. And people looked upon these efforts being made, to sort of bring justice overseas. And they're saying, what about social justice? What about justice for us at home, for our workers, that sort of thing. And there was a real kind of desire for a new social order, I think. Something sort of they saw, a lot of his rhetoric about, preserving democracy and civilization as sort of defending the status quo, right? So they saw, he's saying that the war's about defending kind of what we have, but a lot of people felt like what we have isn't good enough. We need promises of something better that's going to come after this to sort of make it worth it. Um, and I think the last big problem that people had is, again, we're talking about the sort of the separation of the Germans from the Nazis. But a lot of people didn't like this idea, or they at least weren't willing to kind of risk it. So there was this belief that, the Nazis aren't actually unique. What they are is the kind of latest manifestation of this sort of Germanism, right? Of sort of Prussian militarism that's kind of dominated German politics forever and will continue to dominate it. And if we get rid of them, just another group will come in. It's just kind of how the Germans are, right? And so the only way to sort of ensure again that we're not going to be here in another 20 years doing this again is to enact a sort of Carthaginian peace and to, break up Germany into pieces or whatever it was. But this idea of sort of risking it on the good German, a lot of people weren't willing to kind of do that. Yeah.
They were skeptical of that.
Yeah.
Did Menzies' rhetoric change much, do you think, over the 2 years he was Prime Minister, in terms of justification of Australia's war effort and involvement? Or was the censorship so much that it sort of didn't matter in the end? Wasn't really there wasn't an opportunity for people to to have a say.
Sure. I think so. This chapter, I only sort of go up to the fall of France around that time. And the reason for that is because I think that changes a lot of things for a lot of people. I think
Mm.
that, there's kind of a return, in a way, after France falls to a sort of, um, the kind of an old attitude, I suppose, of sort of the importance of Britain and the importance of the empire, right? Because, when the Germans are kind of across the channel, and they're bombing London and they're perhaps threatening to invade Britain, suddenly a lot of people have to kind of reevaluate, well, what sort of, what is that going to mean for us if Australia falls and if the empire kind of falls apart? So I think that, yeah, I think that that changes a lot for a lot of people, and I think that his rhetoric comes to kind of reflect that, and he becomes kind of more, um, more confident in kind of very pro-empire kind of
And,
stand.
and I guess there's that sense that, Poland might have fallen, Czechoslovakia might have fallen, but I mean, for France to fall, France is a great power.
Yeah, yeah,
France is an empire power, has colonies, and that's actually a serious setback in the war if a
yeah.
country like France falls. Aaron, fantastic chapter. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to hear about it, and thank you for your participation in the Menzies Early Career Network.
Oh, so good. Thank you for having me. It was absolute pleasure.